whether you're using theory to help fill in gaps, or you're trying to better understand general principles of humanity, or even just of a particular situation, you said you're always looking for the evidence. You're always looking for something you can hang your hat on. Could you kind of talk me through your process of that then? Like, how do you decide what is the most important cause of something, or the most likely precipitating factor? How do you sort of weigh things when there are technically thousands of causes, but you can only talk about 2 or 3 in an article?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this because it was interesting reading Burns's piece, again, thinking about this, where there seems within that to be this sort of desire to almost quantifiably, or at least very clearly say, this is the main cause of something. And I've been sort of thinking, I don't think I often do that in my work. I don't think, it feels a bit like people making like ultimate sort of lists of the top 10 songs of a band and saying, this is number 1, this is number 2, as if this is like, I would say it doesn't really matter. I'm really not that bothered about about deciding which was the main cause of something. I'm interested in figuring out what are the possible reasons something might have happened, and sort of exploring and considering those things. I think I would very rarely say this thing happened mainly for this reason and slightly less for this reason. That's probably not the kind of history I do. Though having said that, I think there are obviously plenty of people who do that, who will be sort of trying to say this is the main cause of this conflict, or this is the main reason this person, gave this political speech or something like that. I think in general, that's just not the kind of stuff I do. Which is odd to say, like, a historian's not interested in why things happen. But I am, but I'm just not necessarily interested in obsessively weighing those things up and trying to decide which are the most important.
I would accept that in terms of your top 3 reasons why something happened. But I would press you on this a little bit more, because there are surely hundreds of reasons that occur to you, flip through your mind, that you have a tiny bit of evidence for, that you dismiss, that never make it into the article in the first place. So you are technically saying that these are the more likely ones, because they're the ones I actually talk about. So
yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah. Yeah, I think what this is revealing is that I don't have a robust process for making these decisions. So no, I mean, I think my research process generally is read an enormous number of Victorian newspapers until I have a sort of intuitive sense of something, and then try and corral that evidence into a kind of series of explanations that I think are representative of the thing I'm interested in. So I think, generally speaking, I would be looking for as much corroborating evidence of something as I can. So and this is a thing we see a lot now, since we got newspapers digitized, is people will pick out that one source that sort of says something when it's not at all representative, because they've keyword searched it and they found it. And so I'm very cautious of not trying to do that. I want to have enough evidence so that I can say with a reasonable amount of confidence that the 3 or 4, 5 or 6 sources I cite are representative of a much wider phenomenon within the context of what I'm looking at. It might be whether if I'm looking at Anglo-American relations, then I'm talking about really big processes. I might just be talking about something much smaller, in which case, it's a smaller body. But yeah, I think, I honestly don't think I have, come to think of it, a really clear sort of checklist or methodology where I say this is the way I do things. It's a much more, I don't know, casual way of doing things, where I'm just assembling evidence, considering it, looking at it, trying to make sense of it myself, and then seeing what makes a convincing argument. And it's not a very scientific process in that sense.
I mean, I certainly found it difficult. I must have read that paragraph in Burns about 15 times, where he said, assuming you have no evidence, what percentage probability would you put on this happening or that? And then assuming you had this much evidence, how much would you do now? And then divide this by that. Like, it was a very, very quantitative method.
Yeah.
And I understood the concept of what he was trying to explain. I actually did get a piece of scratch paper and try to work out some simple problem. And I agree with you that I probably do something like that implicitly, subconsciously, as I'm reading. So I say, oh, that reminds me of this reminds me of that, and it kind of builds and builds and snowballs until it's an idea. And I said at the beginning of this that you were a trailblazer in DH pedagogy, which I absolutely believe. But I'm curious as to how we go about discussing theory and methodology and historical understanding and historical selection with our students. So if we don't have a firm idea, if I can't on the top of my head explain the methodology for weighing evidence, I am nonetheless conveying that to my students through acculturation or some kind of osmosis of historical learning. How do you approach it with your students? Do you think of methodology or historical judgment as a methodology?
So having basically waffled and said I have no methodology in my own research, I do try and teach students a more systematic way of doing things. So I teach a lot of classes on journalism history or on 19th century social and cultural history that uses digital archives and newspapers as one of their main sources. And students usually have one or two problems. Either they put a keyword search in and they get back 100,000 results and then come to me and say, what do I do now? Or they have the opposite problem where they put search terms in that aren't particularly effective and they get nothing, and therefore, or they get very few things, and then they struggle to sort of frame an argument. So I do teach sort of various methodological steps for refining searches, for creating samples. And this is because I think for most of my students, at least, they're exploring these topics for the first time. They don't have an enormous amount of time to do it in. In my own research, I think I can afford to meander and take a lot more time and just kind of wallow in sources and explore them in a much more casual way, partly just because I'm not under the same time pressure that they are writing an essay in 2 weeks. But when they've got a limited amount of time and they don't have that existing contextual understanding, I do try and teach them things like, okay, how do you take a representative sample of newspapers? You know, whether they're sort of sample, depends on their question, right? Whether they're sort of taking a few every year or a few every month, whether they're selecting based on the newspaper's politics. So we kind of go through all of that and what a sample should be. And so I do try and encourage them to have that methodology, to be able to write in their essays, okay, I'm exploring this phenomenon. I'm basing these conclusions on 500 articles that I've found using this particular method of collecting them. Because I think for them, it allows them to avoid some of the pitfalls of cherry picking and just reading the first 10 articles and then trying to figure out something from there. But I think in my own work, maybe I should do that more in my own work, but generally speaking, I try and read everything when I do something. I mean, you know, I can't do it for every question, but I'm currently writing a book chapter on the history of American cocktails in Victorian Britain. I'm trying to figure out, like, basically the question is, what did the Victorians think of American drinks, and what kind of cultural work did those drinks perform as a kind of intermediary in transatlantic relations? And because I don't have to write it in 2 weeks, I can spend a decent amount of time reading thousands of articles mentioning the word mint julep or cocktail or something like that, just to try and figure it. And when I feel like I've got a strong sense of how representative it is, then I start assembling that evidence into the stuff that works best in an article. But you're right, in teaching, I think we have to model that, because it's not something that necessarily comes naturally. You know, they need some sort of step-by-step process, I think, or at least it helps for some of them.
Yes, I think the time pressure point is a really valid one. I think a lot of people, when they're teaching it, they're saying that the students are novices, or they're unsure, or they're nervous, and the methodology helps them. But I think the time pressure thing is actually quite important, because for most of my research, anything that I'm particularly proud of, we'll say it that way, it's been the result of serendipity. I happen to fall upon a certain article in a certain order of having read things, and it sparked a connection, sometimes with, you know, a documentary I'd seen 10 years previously. Yeah. And it's just a serendipity of all the different things flowing around in my brain. And that's very difficult to manufacture artificially. And I think that's probably the most important thing I would say about theory, is that theory can be very useful in abstracting a lot of those general feelings that we have, but it can't replace the random bits of data we picked up 10 years ago that suddenly just make everything make sense in a certain way. So yeah, I think the idea of the relationship between data and theory is a lot more bound up together than we sometimes think. There's not a clear division of labor between the two things.
You're right. I think that your method of devising new research absolutely mirrors mine, in that my method is generally randomly browse through Victorian newspapers looking for fun stuff to tweet and accidentally find things to write articles about. It's sort of generally how I work. Very rare do I go in with a question. And yet with our students, that's generally what we do, right? We set them a question or ask them to invent one from thin air. And then they have to figure out a method for answering that question. And that's very rarely do I work like that. I think generally speaking, I start with the evidence and figure out how to explain it. Whereas they've been asked to start with a question and find the evidence for it. And that does, yeah, you're right. That serendipity ain't going to do that. Not in the time they got.
No,
so
absolutely not.
I think it's essential. I think and actually, if somebody said to me, you need to write an article in 2 weeks, and here's the question we want you to answer, I think I would probably try and go in with a more robust methodology, a more clear sense of what I'm going to search, how much I'm going to look at. So otherwise, yeah, that's sort of wandering in the dark, isn't it?
And here's the philosophical question we'll leave it with. If you were given a question, something that was socially relevant, socially important, and you had 2 weeks to write your essay on it, do you think it would produce better work?
That's interesting. I think I would produce work that I wouldn't have produced otherwise. I think it would probably force me to think about things I hadn't thought about. It would probably put me out of my comfort zone. So reading Burns's article is the kind of thing I would never normally have read. And it sort of forced me to think about things I haven't thought about before or thought about for a long time. I think that's really useful. I think that's good for us. So in a sense, like being able to choose our own research is a really nice privilege, but it is also a comfort zone, isn't it? It's I do find myself maybe not necessarily taking on those kind of challenges as much as I would, or as much as I did as a student. So I think it's a really powerful thing. I think I would produce. So actually, an example of it is that Cosmopolitan network, right? That's forced me to try and think of something that I never would have thought about before, or frame it in terms I haven't thought about before. I found that really useful. And again, it's that tool for thinking, isn't it? It's that situation of forcing us to answer a question is a really useful way of opening new doors or getting our mind to use different sort of mental muscles, I suppose. I like that. I find that quite exciting. But at the same time, like somebody's got to force me to do it. Otherwise, I'll just keep writing about Victorian jokes.